Hi, I'm Dave Essinger. It is October 20th, 2016, and we are here with visiting writer Robert James Russell and his new novel, Messiah. Robert, can you start off by telling us some about your work?
Sure, and thank you for having me here. Yeah, my work tends to focus a lot on place. I'm really fascinated with the boundary between place and relationship. So often when we think of a specific place, we have a memory or an emotion tied to that, and I'm really kind of fascinated with that. So that tends to come out a lot in all the writing that I do.
And I think we can see that obviously because Messiah is a Western. But I want to come back to that too, but I've read some other works of yours that are also very, I thought, embedded in place. Tell us about A Sea of Trees. I thought was really interesting. That also is very place-bound. Can you tell us about that some too?
Yeah, so Sea of Trees was the first short book I wrote, and it takes place entirely in this forest in Japan called Aokigahara Forest, which is a real place called the Suicide Forest. And that was kind of a turning point for me, for my work starting to focus on place, to be honest, because I was writing a story that took place entirely in a forest, and it really forced me to think about the woods, the forest, its history as cheesy, but as a character in the story as well too, and how these characters' journeys through the forest, physically climbing over things and touching things and smelling things, and how important these sort of sensory acts are to the experience, and it kind of lit a fire in my head after that. Researching, I've been into camping and hiking for most of my life. So when I wrote Sea of Trees, I could very easily recall being in the woods, being in a quiet woods, listening to the wind howling and how that sounds and the branches knocking together, and recall that. But yeah, it was a big turning point for how I approached all of my fiction, short and long, at that point.
Okay, well, obviously, I concur that that setting is just essential as far as introducing conflict, giving us an interesting place, a scenery, a backdrop for the story to take place. I saw. Did you see Murakami's latest tweet about setting? This went out a while ago. If I kind of see if I can get this right, Haruki Murakami's comment was, "If a scene could possibly take place in a hot air balloon, it probably should." Which might be overplaying it a little bit, but we have a lot of things in hot air balloons.
Sure,
That'd be hard to do.
It's not nearly enough hot air balloon fiction out there, as far as I'm concerned.
I predict a lot more of that based on in response to this, right?
Yeah.
But how about that? Have there been times when you have consciously reset a scene, put it someplace more interesting that kind of lit it up for you?
It's interesting. I approach a lot of my writing with the place first, actually. I might have the idea of what the story is, but that idea is it runs parallel to the place. If I have an idea like, I should, write a breakup story that takes place at a, old 50s diner, a retro kind of diner, well, then I already have the place, and I have the story, and it kind of works out together that way. And a lot of my ideas end up happening that way. So I have had that happen in the past where I write maybe like a short relationship piece, and it takes place in an apartment, and now I'm changing it to make it in a crowded restaurant or something like that. But so much of my writing, I think, is tied to place, and the ideas that I even have for the stories are tied to place. When I read news and go on the internet and look for ideas and stuff, a lot of what inspires me is like, this place, this thing, this national park would be a good setting for this, and kind of build out from that. So not as much as I used to be perfectly honest. I build from setting first out and explore, what can I do in this setting even? And I know that I want to be in this specific place. So.
Okay, so clearly it makes sense to start with place in a lot of these works. And I know that you have deep roots in the Midwest, obviously. So a couple of these works, Messiah is out in the Southwest desert. Sea of Trees is in Japan. But you also have, yeah, this deep background and setting in the Midwest. And we were just talking in my class about, is there such a thing as Midwestern regional literature? Could you tell us what you think about that? Is there such a thing?
Yeah, absolutely there is. Regionalist literature has always been a thing. The Midwest regional literature bandwagon has been pretty recent. Historically, and less now, but you still see some of it here. The Midwest, it's considered flyover country, right? There's nothing worth anything here. And again, we've been seeing that in the last 10 or 15 years or so start to erode away. And people realize there's a lot going on here, that we're more than just farms and factories and blue-collar workers, that we have histories and mythologies and dishes, statewide dishes, food and culture and all this stuff is actually here. But, historically people, you grow up somewhere and you move to the coast, especially as a writer, that's where you make it. You move to New York. Sure. Now you're a New York writer. And nobody really asks you about growing up in nowhere, Kansas, right? They ask you about New York and they ask you about your books, and there you go. But, for the last 8 to 10 years, you're really starting to see people embrace this sort of regionalist work. People are, you see it in food culture. People want local everything. Mm-hmm. People see that they want to know where their food comes from. They want to know where their art comes from as well, too. And that's a really exhilarating thing, because for so long, the Midwest was looked over. I mean, you have Winesburg, Ohio is the quintessential Midwest novel for so many years. But after that, and of course, there are great Midwestern writers. Toni Morrison, Ohio writer. Sure. I mean, absolutely. But people still didn't focus on the actual place itself. And you started really seeing that change fairly recently, and it's exciting, I think, to show people what we know that we have here. Being born and bred in Michigan and seeing more people write about Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes and showcasing that with people. I mean, growing up, I didn't read much about that. I mean, I experienced it in person in Michigan, but not everybody was necessarily writing about this in fiction, and that's exciting.
So do you feel like there's more of a readership for this, writing about the Midwest, than there has been in past decades?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not even going to pretend to understand why that shift happened. It could be for any number of reasons. The economy collapsing, forcing people to start looking more local for things. Perhaps that's part of it as well too. But there was really a big cultural shift where people wanted everything to be local artists, mm-hmm. local food, local cuisine, local culture, and really start focusing on that. And I think that's an amazing thing, because when we forego these local things, I mean, we lose our identity, right? I mean, this is why main streets across small towns all across the country kind of boarded up and went away, because they kind of lost their identity that they had. And
Sure.
Jobs move out of the city, and I get that, obviously that happens, but people are realizing that there's identity to be had in these places, and they want to be known to be from this small town. And that's exciting, when historically it was no, I'm leaving here and never looking back.
The place you're from.
Exactly.
Right?
The place you're from. Nobody wants to be from the place you're from, right?
Sure. That's a good insight, though, about identity and kind of spreading into other genres. And a lot of small towns have had that issue with Main Street. Findlay's been working on that for some time, and I think we're seeing a resurgence of Main Street USA in a lot
Absolutely.
of small towns. And you've done great work promoting so much of this identity in literature with Voices of the Midwest, with Midwestern Gothic. Do you want to tell us about Midwestern Gothic fast?
Sure. Midwestern Gothic is a journal co-founded by myself and Jeff Fowler, a good friend of mine I've known since college, and we started it just about 7 years ago. And the idea was simple, that at the time, nobody was focusing exclusively on Midwestern writers and literature. There were most definitely journals in the Midwest, but nobody was really trying to say, we're trying to help the conversation move forward with Midwestern writers and Midwestern art and what that means. So we jumped, we we joke all the time that it's, I mean, like anything else, it's location, location, location.
Sure.
We found success because nobody was doing exactly this, and we jumped on it, and it worked out well. But you know, we, up until this past month, we've published quarterly. We just had our 23rd issue. Now we're going to be moving to a biannual publication schedule, which is going to allow us more time to publish books. We have a book publishing wing called MG Press, and that biannual publication will give us more time to focus on that and help market and push our stuff even further. But you know, the goal of Midwestern Gothic is to focus on work that features the Midwest in some way, or is inspired by the Midwest in some way, or writers who aren't necessarily born and raised here, but who have had experience here. So, for example, if you're born and raised in California, but you spent a week at your grandparents' farm in Iowa, I want to see that story, sure. Right? I want to see that story as much as I want to see someone who's born and raised in Iowa on that farm, because that idea, that different perception of this place is exactly why we started this journal. We want to see the Midwest through the eyes of everyone who experiences it. That's exciting.
I was really privileged to contribute a piece to the last issue where my take was I'm a Midwesterner completely out of my element. Put me in some mountains, and I had no idea where I was.
Right.
You know? And so I think all about the relation of people to place is just fascinating, and the fish out of water context is always great fodder for writing.
Absolutely.
Well, okay, on the topic of finding something that hasn't been done and
sure.
doing more of that. So yeah, Westerns. Not a lot of people have been doing Westerns, it seems like. Or we think Western, we think, a genre that hasn't been written in heavily for a lot. We think, old cowboy movies, right? What drew you to the genre?
I think when I was a kid, I've liked Western movies since I was a kid. I think what drew me to them was this idea of place, actually. There's nothing like a Western that demands that you have to interact with the environment in a Western, because Westerns represent this time period in America, right, where people saw the West as a blank canvas. You could go reinvent yourself, and it was inhospitable at times or often to people, but it's this big blank canvas where you could go out there and have land and kind of start yourself over, and that was the allure of the American dream, right? Sure. And growing up in Michigan, seeing desert landscapes was just alien to me and beautiful, and I still think they're beautiful. And this idea that this space is just never ending. I mean, if you go to Arizona and you just look out, it's in Michigan, if I'm looking at a forest and there's maybe a house there, I know that at some point there's probably going to be another house at the other end of that forest. But go to Arizona and you look at the desert, and it's just desert, 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 and that is it fascinated me when I was a kid. And that forced interplay of man versus nature I really like too, because no other genre demands that characters or the work itself interact with nature other than the Western. It has to. If you have a romantic comedy, it can literally be set in any city you want. It's irrelevant for the most part. The characters meet at this place instead of this place, this landmark instead of this landmark. Okay, but a Western, it has to be set in a specific place. It has to interact with the environment, because that's part of what makes a Western, and I was really fascinated with that.
They happen in the West.
And they happen in the West. And people call stuff modern Westerns if we're dealing with certain themes that were prevalent in Westerns. That's really interesting too, but it's a uniquely American genre like nothing else. And that, as I got older, was something that I really appreciated. And I got older and I realized with Westerns that what we think of when we think of Western movies are mostly inaccurate. Most people, scholars have come out and said that most people in the West were not actually white, although when you watch a Western movie, everyone's white, right? The number of people of color in the West was actually staggering, which it makes sense because it was other people's lands that we took over. And that's the flip side of the stream, right? If the West in this time period represents the great expanse, the American dream, it also was an American nightmare for a lot of people. I mean, you really didn't have much of a say if you weren't a white man. Native peoples were pushed off their land, killed in a lot of cases. I mean, it was simultaneously this really beautiful push to kind of start your own life only if you looked a certain way, and then also a nightmare for everyone else. That interplay as I got older kind of further fascinated me too, because again, there's no other genre that's kind of has this dual narrative at the center, right? Like that kind of built into it. Mm-hmm. And that's really fascinating, I think.
I think, and it draws on a few different eras, as in, there's the actual, late 19th century when this was unfolding historically. Then we get like the 30s and the 40s, the cowboy,
right.
black and white Hollywood,
right.
which was packaging the whole thing for a very different kind of
sure.
consumption. We get this. I think this is when we get all the genre iconography. We think Western, we think John Wayne, we think
sure.
cowboys, white hats. Was that? You get all that deep iconography kind of built in going into it. Is that a thing that you are intentionally playing with, or emphasizing, or subverting in the writing now?
Yeah, I'm trying to subverting it for sure. For as far as I'm concerned, Westerns really hit their stride in the 60s or so when they started being revisionist Westerns, because mm-hmm. the early Westerns like that, the bad guy wears a black hat, the good guy wears a white hat. The native characters are fools, right, played by white people usually, and they're being made fun of the whole time, and women as well too, right? And then people started realizing that it's this really great genre, this morally gray genre, right? It's not that there's a hero in a white hat, there's a reluctant hero or an anti-hero, right, born of the
sure.
genre. That is called upon to do some great deed, pulled back into society from the outskirts of society, and that's really cool. I like that. So I guess I'm continuing the work of what revisionist Westerns started that way. Like,
right.
I'm trying to be faithful to the time period in every way that I can. I'm trying to tell story at the same time, but I like this confliction that everyone has. You live here in a lawless time, in a lawless place in the West, right? And that was a fact. It was a lawless place. So it's interesting to me that dynamic of what the people are like. They're not all bad people, but clearly they're going to be a little, morally jammed up, which
sure.
which is more fun to write about. It's more fun to read
Absolutely.
about that way. And it's not obviously correct looking at those old movies that this is, every good guy wore a white hat, like, obviously not, right?
Right.
And Westerns to me became inherently more interesting after that point, when they realized that there's a lot of wiggle room here to play with, what we can do here and what we can present as a good guy. Who is the good guy? Who is the bad guy? So
it's got to be fun just diving into that, like not only the prefab setting that creates so much of the conflict and the history you can draw upon, but and then that the preconception that we all have when we hear Western, and so you can expect us to expect certain things.
right.
I don't want to go down too far a tangent. We could talk, film theory and Western
Right.
genre
All day.
iconography for a long time, but that's fun. But I wanted to ask also about other writers who have influenced your work, people who you find inspiring, or writers you try to sound like, or other writers who've kind of built up the Western genre that you're echoing.
Yeah, I would say my biggest inspiration is Elmore Leonard, for sure. His collected Western stories is, as far as I'm concerned, a must read. Even if you don't think you like Westerns, to read his work, you'll like Westerns. I read a lot of Louis L'Amour when I was
Sure.
a kid. That really inspired me, just storytelling wise, right? Like, I'm really into plot. I like plot. Plot for a lot of writers is a dirty word. We don't talk about plot.
I love plot.
Yeah, I know, I do too. I love plot. Plot is great, and I think it's necessary. If we absolutely forego plot, it takes a very skilled writer. I'm not this skilled. It takes a very skilled writer to write something without plot and still keep our interest, right? That's not me. So I like plot. Plot is something I can depend on. We're moving forward to this point. How do I get to this point, to this point, to this point? And Elmore Leonard is amazing at that. And he showed me that
Right.
you can be a literary writer that have that literary quality but work in genre like that. What he does in crime and what he did in westerns, what he started doing in westerns, shows that. And Louis L'Amour, actually, as far as I'm concerned, is, I hate to say he's overlooked because everyone knows Louis L'Amour, but I don't think a lot of people have actually read his work other than diehard Western fans. And he's a tremendous writer too, but one of the things you learn from Westerns is how to plot and pace. And growing up when I was younger and reading this stuff, it was really eye-opening, like, oh, this is how you pace a book. This is what happens when someone's chasing someone else. This is how long you should spend describing this town or this gun or whatever like that, right? And both of those, Zane Grey too a little bit, but I think Elmore Leonard and Louis L'Amour are the tops for me in Westerns. But and actually Louis L'Amour's autobiography, and I'm blanking on the name, it is the best autobiography I've ever read in my entire life. Like, this man sailed on a junk ship to Asia and lived in Asia for a while, and he did like fist fight. I mean, it's crazy. It's so crazy. It's so good. It's so good.
I'll have to find that.
Yeah, gotta remember the name.
It sounds like he had plenty of plot to draw from.
Yeah.
In the life there. As a side note, I hear everybody say that. Like, people say plot's a dirty word. But I've never run into anybody yet who's anti-plot. I love plot.
I think people don't want to admit that they don't like plot, right? And you see, and I guess what I mean by this is, characterization of what's happening in the book. Characterization can be plot, absolutely.
Sure.
Right? When you're talking about a longer work that becomes a navel-gazing novel, and I don't mean that even in a bad way, but a book where nothing really happens, but we're learning about people, that takes a deft hand to be able to pull that off and make us care for that person and keep being interested in it. Again, I don't have that ability, and I'm fine with that.
That's tough to do.
It is very tough to do. It's very tough to do, which is why I think plot is crucial. Knowing how your characters get to one place, it also helps you as a writer too, because I know I don't have to spend a lot of time here. This is what I need to focus on next, etc. And it kind of helps teach you the pace, I think, of what you should be doing in your work. And pace is one of those things that can destroy a story or a book. If the pace is off, it's hard to keep reading it.
I agree. Internal plot is a fantastic thing, but it's tough to fuel a thing exclusively on that. I'm a big fan of external plot to make something happen, the bait and switch while the other stuff develops, I mean, okay, obviously there are a lot of things that are over-plotted. We think, big Hollywood
Michael
or something.
Bay films, right?
Yeah, lots of explosions.
Right.
And I'm going to put more explosions and car chases in my next book, I promise. But sure. I mean, we were just talking earlier too, though, about genre and people's misconceptions about genre. I think I'd agree. I think people think Western and they think, I won't like this, or they think, in my class this morning, we were talking about classic sci-fi, and a couple students were surprised. I actually like this. We were reading Blade Runner by Philip K. Dick, but I think there's a lot of bad writing in some genres, which can turn somebody off to it, but there's a lot of fantastic writing within that genre too, and there's a lot of, I think, brilliant writing that pushes the boundaries of genre too.
Absolutely.
It sounds like, and I know that some of that's what's happening here, in that you're subverting and kind of pushing the envelope of modern Western. Is that a thing, modern Western?
Yeah. You see more in film, something will be classified as a modern Western. You see it less in literature, although I'm sure there's some examples that are escaping me at the moment that I could think of with more time. But yeah, that's definitely a thing. Yeah.
I think it's a fantastic read, and would love to see more of it. And that's the next project is a continuation of this and longer, fuller, like novel length.
Novel length, yep.
Does it have a title yet?
Yeah, it's called New Plains. It'll be out in 2017 from Dock Street Press. I refuse to use the word sequel because I hate that. Implies that you have to have read the first book. And you don't need to read the first book for this.
It's a viable standalone.
It's a viable standalone. I've been calling it a follow-up. It's a fuller book. It follows a character from this book 10 years after the setting of this book. And I hate being so obscure, but I don't want to ruin it for
Sure,
people.
absolutely, yeah. And you can also find Messiah out now from Dock Street Press. They're online,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
I guess that's the what's next for you question. Are there other things you're working on while New Plains is coming out? Are there new projects nascent?
Always. I mean, it's raining new projects. I have a really bad
Fantastic.
habit of trying to do, I get, Christmas morning kid eyes. I'm like, oh, this would be the thing I should work on next, and I end up writing a bunch of stuff. But I am working on another book simultaneously and some short stories. So
So you
none
have
of which
like
are westerns.
half a dozen things going on at
Yeah.
once, like I do.
Yeah.
And I can't just buckle down and finish the one thing
No,
because something
no,
else
no.
lights up.
That's right.
Yeah. That's good though. It's good to always have
I think so.
something you're excited about
I think
to
so.
write about. Well, we're excited to see what comes next. Thanks a lot for being here. We're looking forward to your reading on campus tonight. Let's see. Where can people find out more about you and your work? You have a website out there too.
Yeah, and robertjamesrussell.com. I'm on Twitter at Rob Hollywood. It's a long story, don't ask.
That's a great story.
Yeah, it's actually not that great of a story. It's just a long story. And those are the two best ways to get a hold of me. And thank you for having me. I'm delighted, obviously, to be here. This is fantastic.
We're thrilled that you could make it out here. Robert, thanks.
Thanks.